Okay, everybody, good morning. My name's Joe, and welcome to Skagway, Alaska. Skagway is a very unusual name for a town. That's because it's not really an English word. The original word was pronounced Skagway, and in the native people's language that lived in this area, they were the Tlingit tribe. Skagway means the windy place. They thought it was so windy, in fact, they didn't actually live right here. They lived 9 miles west of here in a place called Dai. They only came over to Skagway to fish and hunt, and they thought anyone who came here other than to fish and hunt was crazy. But I live here. So moving on from there, Skagway had 3 booms in its history. The first one was the gold rush period from 1897 to 1898 was the boom time in Skagway during the gold rush. The second boom was World War II. After the Japanese Navy attacked 2 of the Aleutian Islands, Kiska and Attu, it made the Canadians and the Americans very nervous because the Japanese Navy was on our back doorstep. So the Army came up and they leased the railroad from the company, the White Pass Railroad, and used it to ferry the manpower and materiel from the port in Skagway to Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon Territory. They used that material and manpower to build the Alcan Highway north and south from Whitehorse, and also to build the Canada Oil Pipeline, 2 vital projects for the Allied war effort. Now, when the Army came up also, they built these barracks right here that are now the Westmark Inn. When the war was over, they sold these buildings Army surplus. They were the Army surplus deal of the century because now it costs you $150 a night to stay in one of those rooms. Now, when the railroad was first built in 1898, the tracks went right down the center of Broadway, a very busy street. And when the Army saw how the vehicles and pedestrians crossing the tracks on Broadway slowed down the trains with the manpower and materiel on them, it drove the Army crazy. So the Army moved the tracks to the back side of town, and they've been over there since 1942. Over to our left you can see where the tracks are today. We're going to turn right here, and we're going to be looking at the railroad buildings on the left side of the vehicle as we turn right. The salmon-colored building on the very corner is the original train station built in 1898. Right across the street from it is a green building called the Loom. As I turn right at the stop sign, look behind the Loom, you will see a building back there called Jeff Smith's Parlor. Jeff Smith was a con man and a criminal. I'll be telling you more about his activities at the cemetery. Right in front of us we have the Red Onion Saloon. The Red Onion Saloon is an original Gold Rush era saloon. When it was first built, it had a brothel on the 2nd floor. Today, it's a brothel museum. There are still a couple of ladies in the windows. They're a little stiff these days. I think it's arthritis. Going around the corner, we have on the left-hand side a driftwood-covered building, which is the Arctic Brotherhood building. It was built in 1899, and back then, in order to belong to that fraternity, you had to be a prospector, a gold prospector. But the last member inducted into that organization was not a prospector. He was the President of the United States. His name was Warren G. Harding, and in 1923 he was inducted into that organization. On the right-hand side, coming up, we have the Mascot Saloon, a completely restored Gold Rush era saloon. It was restored to the point where there are actually men standing at the bar in there. And look, they're already stiff today too. On the left-hand side we have Deadman's Photo Studio, this blue building. Originally that belonged to Eric Hegg, a very famous Gold Rush era photographer. He was most famous for his photos of the Golden Staircase. One of those photos is reproduced in a painting on the brown building to our left. The men going single file up the mountain in pursuit of the gold. Coming up on the right hand side we have a peach colored building, which is today the hardware store. Down behind it to the right is a weathered building with white trim. That was, during the gold rush, the St. James Hotel. That's where the contracts were signed between the financial interest for the railroad and the construction interest for the railroad back in 1898. Coming up ahead of us is a white building with red trim and blue awnings, Kermsey's Curio Shop. Herman Kermsey was a very interesting Gold Rush character. I'll be telling you some stories about him later coming down the mountain. Also coming up on our right-hand side is an alley. Take a look down the alley to our right and you will see a log cabin surrounded by a picket fence. That was the home of Captain William Moore, the founder of Skagway. In 1887, he was the one and only resident in town. On the left-hand side, we have the Wells Fargo Bank. A robbery happened there in 1902. It's a very interesting story. I'll tell you later on coming down the mountain. Also on the left-hand side, we have the only mailbox in Skagway, that blue mailbox right there, right in front of the post office, located for the convenience of the postmaster. They don't deliver your mail in Skagway. You have to go to the post office and collect it. So much for the dark of night and depth of snow story. It does not apply here. Coming up ahead, we're going to be seeing a red building with white trim. The first floor of that building during the Gold Rush was a bakery, and the second floor was a brothel. So you could get hot buns in the morning, and you could get hot buns at night. They were quite a bit more expensive at night, especially by the dozen. Now we're in the suburbs of Skagway, and this is where the 800 permanent residents live. You'll notice some of these houses here are well kept, and some of them are not. That's because the Joneses have not moved up here yet. These houses begin in price at $250,000. The reason they're so expensive is private land here is very scarce. Most of the land here is owned by the federal government through the National Park Service. The Park Service even owns many of the commercial buildings downtown, and they lease those buildings out to the merchants. Just up ahead, we're going to see a gray building with a blue roof, and that is the Tribal Community Center for the local Native people, the Tlingit Indians. They hold their tribal events inside that building. Now, because the real estate prices are so high here, so also are the rents. $1,000 a month minimum for a one-bedroom apartment. That's more than those of us that come up here to work for the summer can afford. So most of us live in campgrounds like this one coming up on our right. Just to rent a lot of land in this campground to put your whole bus, your trailer, or your RV on costs $740 a month. That includes a hookup for water, sewage, and electricity. Now, the first summer I worked here, I did not have a vehicle, so I lived in a tent. Take a look down 14th Avenue to our right here, and you will see some white tents with gray roofs. I lived in one of those wall tents, an 8-foot by 10-foot wall tent. A unique experience. 5 months in a tent. The first couple nights I was in the tent in April of 2006, it snowed. I began to think my friends and relatives were right. But after a while, the weather improved. Stop snowing, and you get acclimatized to living in a tent. So I managed to last that whole first summer living there. Since then, though, I moved on up to the east side. Now I live in a little RV right across from us here that says Lindy on the back of it. It's not much bigger than the tent was, but it's much more comfortable. In there I have heat, I have lights, I have hot water, I have my own fridge and stove, and even air conditioning. I found out last summer. Usually you don't need air conditioning in Skagway, so when I bought that thing, it was 25 years old. I never bothered to check the air conditioner. But last summer it was 90 degrees here. I turned it on, and what do you know, it worked. Right to our right is an unusual house. There were tires up on the roof. I'm not really sure why they're there. Maybe it's a mobile home. Coming up ahead is a place you could probably pick up cheap. It's a handyman special. The handyman begun to work on it about a month ago and put a brand new roof on it. It used to have 4 boards on the roof. He kind of spoiled my joke, but I have a feeling the handyman might be a little late fixing that place up. It looks like it's ready to fall down. But you could probably pick that place up cheap, maybe $100,000. Coming up, we're going to see the rail yard. And on the right-hand side of the rail yard, you will see an old steam locomotive that goes all the way back to the Gold Rush era. It no longer runs, but I understand they're working on getting it running again someday. There are other steam locomotives, 2 others that the White Pass Railroad runs. a few days a week during the busy part of the season. And then these yellow and green diesel locomotives here run pretty much every day. They're the most modern ones in the fleet, and those locomotives run pretty much every day. They run on diesel fuel. We're going to turn right here and go into the Gold Rush Cemetery and visit the graves of a couple of distinguished residents that got here by shooting each other. It all started on July 8th, 1898, when a man named John Stewart came down from the gold fields with a bag full of gold worth $2,700. He went into Jeff Smith's parlor downtown, not knowing Jeff Smith was also known as Soapy Smith, a crook and a con man. He put his bag of gold on the bar and he ordered himself a drink. While he was having the drink, a thief ran in, grabbed his gold, and ran out the back door. Two patrons in the bar jumped up as though to pursue the thief, but what they were really doing was blocking the door. So Stewart couldn't catch the thieves, nor could he get a positive ID. Those two bar patrons were actually members of Soapy Smith's gang, but Stewart did not know that at the time. But Stewart was very angry his gold had been stolen. He went around to all the merchants in town and said to them, "Look, if you fellas don't get my gold returned to me, I'm going to go down to the lower 48 states and tell every newspaper man who will listen to me what a pack of thieves everyone in Skagway is, and that no one should come to Skagway and buy their Gold Rush supplies from you fellas." Well, that certainly got the merchants' attention. So the merchants called Soapy aside. They said, "Look, Soapy, you have to return Mr. Stewart's gold." Soapy refused. So the merchants called for a meeting to be held to resolve this problem. They did not want Soapy in that meeting because Soapy was a smooth speaker, and they were afraid that if Soapy got into the meeting, he might sway the meeting in his favor. So to keep Soapy out, they posted guards at the end of the wharf. One of those guards was named Frank Reed. Frank Reed stopped Soapy when he tried to get into the meeting, and Soapy and Frank Reed argued. Then they pushed and shoved each other. Then they drew guns and they fired at each other. Soapy Smith received a wound to the heart. He died immediately. Frank Reed received a wound to the groin. He died 12 agonizing days later. Those are the gentlemen whose graves we're going to visit here in the graveyard.